Right, welcome everyone to our weekly call, which, as you all know, this week we're going to focus primarily on the support for Encrypted Client Hello, or ECH, within the Chrome browser. And it's really a follow-on from the call of 2 weeks ago, where we ran through a whole series of questions on the planned private prefetch proxy within Chrome. So this was the second topic that Kenji kindly agreed to run through with us. So that'll be the bulk of the conversation on the call, but time permitting, I'll also sort of touch on a few other recent developments and also some additions to the list of future call topics and any other business that anyone wishes to raise. So without further ado, let's kick off on the ECH discussion. So you should be able to follow the discussion on the screen with the sort of questions that we're running through. So we'll do this as we did last time. So we'll roll through in case anyone doesn't have the screen in front of them. I'll read out the questions, which is the easy bit, and then Kenji will do the harder bit, which is to provide a few answers here and there. So we'll literally take these from top to bottom. First question on ECH in the Chrome browser, Kenji. Nice easy one to start, I think. What are the timescales and key milestones for ECH support, and what is its current status?
Yeah, so thanks for having me again. I think last time we talked about ECH was in November 3rd, 2020. I think I have the date correct. And so I think at the time I made a prognostic about how fast things would go, and I totally got it wrong. And so instead of like giving you yet another like time scale that is probably going to be wrong, I'm going to give you a more conservative answer, is that we don't have any concrete timeline to share at this moment. The implementation is still going on. And I think the best way for anyone like that wants to know like how soon is this going to be launched and so on, the best way would be to follow the progress over our like public tracker. So I'm going to put the link in the chat so that people can maybe subscribe to the bug, because that would be the best way to know what is going on, like what progress is being made, rather than having me like come every year and giving you the latest like diagnostic. So that's my answer to that question.
Perfect. And yeah, for anyone watching the recording, I'll also put the link in the notes as well, so people can get it that way if they're not seeing the chat in the recording. Okay, right. Is ECH support in response to consumer demand, and maybe to expand on that, or is it more a demand from the internet ecosystem?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, because I think over the weekend last time I was like wondering about it. I think a better question to ask ourselves is whether or not like there is consumer demand for privacy. And I think it should be pretty clear by now that it's real. A lot of like users really want like better privacy online. There is like plenty of survey that shows that this is something that a lot of users care about. And so now you have to ask yourself, do we say like, yeah, sure, we're going to improve privacy, but not in those like specific ways? Or are we going to go full in and say, yes, we are going to improve privacy, and that means addressing privacy issues from A to Z? And I think it's more important to think about it in this way. It's a bit like security, right? Like if, let's say you're driving a car and your airbag only works when you arrive at the destination, that's not a great security feature, right? And so I think ECH is a bit in the same way. It's a way to get better privacy. It's a piece of the puzzle. Is that the only one? Surely not, but it's important. I think that's the way we think about ECH.
Okay, thank you. And then, so what are the development plans for ECH across different platforms? So, for example, sort of mobile, desktop apps, etc.
Yeah, so I'm not too sure about the apps aspect, because I'm only looking after the web platform and the browser. So I would just answer for the mobile and desktop platform. So we don't see ECH as like a platform-specific feature. And so we do want to bring this feature to Chrome, wherever the platform might be. That being said, there are some platforms that have unique constraints or complexities. And so it could be the case that ECH support may be kind of like roll out later for some of those platforms. But we do want to provide ECH across the board.
Yeah, that's clear. Thanks. Maybe a sort of follow from that, is ECH support being added to Chromium, or is it a specific feature within Chrome to differentiate between the two?
Yeah, so the answer here is yes, but I think we need to be a bit careful about what we mean by that. Like the code is being landed into the public repository, Chromium repository, but it's up to each Chromium browser to decide whether or not they want to enable this feature and how they want to like support it. So it doesn't mean like because the code is there doesn't automatically mean that every Chromium browser is going to have this feature at the same time that we might have. It could also be the case that some Chromium browser go first, like who knows, right? So that's the way things work in Chromium. It's not yeah, it's not like a straight conclusion that because the code is there, then therefore the feature would be available across the board.
Yeah. So to pick a random example, so Brave would need to decide that they want to enable the feature. It won't just magically appear one day.
Yeah, and we've seen that with DNS over HTTPS, for instance.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Does Google intend to support ECH on their cloud platform?
Yeah, so here, like, I'm only representing the Chrome side of things, so I'm not able to speak on the behalf of the other teams at Google, and I don't even know their plan, so I could not answer that question. I'm sorry.
Fair enough. And I think the last in this particular sort of tranche of where is, are there plans to support ECH on Linux or Linux?
Yeah, so here, assuming that this is like ECH support in Chrome for Linux, the answer is yes. As I said earlier, if it turned out that it's a bit harder to do because like the platform is a bit uneven, like you have many distributions on Linux, so there could be a situation where there is no one approach that fits all, and so it might take a little bit longer. We've certainly seen that with DNS over HTTPS. I think the support for Linux came a bit later, but we do intend to provide ECH across the board.
Yeah, so even if it's not the same time frame, it will be coming at some point. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, thank you. And since we're talking about ECH, what version of ECH is being implemented? Are you currently in line with the latest ITF draft, which I think is 14, and have any custom changes been made so far?
Yeah, so I think here again, I think we had a similar question last time I joined this meeting in 2020. And at the time I said we were tracking draft number 8. Obviously, a lot has changed. And so I also said that at the time we intended to switch to a newer draft, like incorporate a newer change even, just depending on like the shape of things. And so as you can imagine, like with 6 new iterations on the draft and maybe more as we speak, like this kind of like, this is what we are doing right now. It's not as useful as I thought it would be. And so I think that rather than telling you like we are like tracking draft number 14 or not, I think it's important to realize that things change and we keep changing, because part of the way things work is that the implementer like Chrome and other browsers are trying to implement this feature, and they are finding things that don't quite work as it should, or maybe the spec is not quite clear sometimes, and back and forth, right? So the things we do on our end is going to influence the spec, and what the spec is doing is also going to influence what we do. And so it is kind of like continuous like feedback cycle. And so it's going to be a learning process with twists and turns. But that said, if the current draft is super important for specific folks, maybe for compatibility reasons, I can offer to follow up offline and see how we can make this work. Like I don't want to give you a number and like that number being stale. I think it would be better to get in touch with people who want to know what version we're tracking at the moment so that we can keep it things in syncs. And so I can follow up later via email, I think would be better. So that's part one of the question. For the custom change part, as far as I can tell, we haven't made any custom change. But I'd say like with all nascent feature, sometimes we want to experiment with a few variation and report what we find back to the spec author so that we can improve the feature. And it's not specific to ECH at all. It's something that we do all the time with any like nascent statements, right? And so again, if the concern is we want to make sure that we have something that is compatible, I think it's better to follow up offline.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Well, I think I'm reading into that, Kenji, that I think your intention is probably as the standard finalizes and goes into release, that is highly likely you'll be consistent with that, but rather than the intermediate steps necessarily, because as you say, there've been quite a few changes. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so since you sort of touched briefly on interop there, I think, have you been coordinating with any other parties to implement the ECH server side?
So like there is nothing specific to share at the moment. We did like trying to see if we could work with a couple of folks, but I think so far there's still work to be done on the implementation side. So I think it's a bit too early to share a bit more details on that. And again, last time we talked, I think we had similar question. We are definitely interested in like getting in touch with folks who want to like make sure that what they have is compatible with what we have, and vice versa. And so I'm happy to follow up offline. Like we want to make sure that this feature works well. And so if someone is interested to work on like making it so, like glad to follow up offline.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. And are Google plans on using anything other than DNS for the ECH configs?
So we don't have any plan to use anything beyond DNS at this moment. Again, that being said, if people have concern about this particular plan or have ideas of like follow-ups, that's something maybe just like be honest. Like I think that's something that should be shared on the ITF mailing list, because that could be interesting to many more folks than just us.
Okay. And I realize looking at question J, that's quite similar to question H. You sort of answered that, which is, have you or will you be partnering with specific site hosts or CDNs to test ECH? And if so, which?
Yeah, so here, like same answer as the question H, I think.
Yeah, fair enough.
So
I should have spotted the duplication. I missed that one for some reason. Fair enough. Any other thoughts on interoperability testing other than people reaching out to you if they have an interest in testing with you? So anything else on that?
Yeah. So here I think we had a similar question last time, and the answer is roughly the same. I think in the past, what we've done with TLS 1.3 was working well. And so, yeah, so I think that's the best way to do, right? The way it worked at the time was that, again, like this idea of having implementers try to implement the feature as expected in the current draft, providing feedback about things that are not quite clear, so that we can make sure that everyone agrees on the meaning of the words. So that's one way to do it. The other thing that maybe we are considering doing is we have this TLS test suite, and so we're trying to reuse the same approach where we have this thing that is open source, so that everyone can agree on the test run and making sure that we exercise as much as possible. So that would be our preferred approach. Again, I think it's a bit early to tell you, hey, we have like a fully fledged like test suite that people can use, but that's the plan, right? We want to make sure that the implementation are compatible with one another. So that's one thing. Then maybe on the DNS side, because there is a DNS deployment component to this, I think this still is an area of ongoing learning and improvement. And so if there are people who have been looking into deploying ECH on the DNS side and have like feedback to share, I think here that could be useful to share more broadly as well. So yeah, looking for more feedback on that front.
Thanks. I guess a general comment on this as well is people that are interested in interop testing, etc., are probably also aware that the TLS working group is obviously also closely involved in that. So I think there's a lot of dialogue via the working group on interop testing.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on to a bit more specificity, if I can say the word properly. Has Google experienced any challenges in developing the ECH functionality for the browser? So I guess this is one of the things that other would-be implementers might learn from building on your experiences.
Yeah, so I've talked to the team to see if they had like any kind of like interesting story to share. Sadly, there is no such a thing. It's just the usual, like implementing something that is like being spec'd as we speak, providing feedback. So like whenever that happens, you can imagine that it's not straightforward, right? Like sometimes you read a spec and you're not quite sure what it means. And so you try to implement it and then you share that back to the spec author, you get some feedback and so on. So there's nothing unique about that. Like this is the case for almost every feature that I've been working on, because it's always this kind of like the standard say X. What do you mean by X? Like sometimes it's not quite clear, right? So that's the only challenge I would say. Like at least from the team point of view, like the complexity of the feature seems to be like what they are used to. Maybe for some of the team that could be a bit different. But yeah, so that's essentially the takeaway is there is nothing interesting to share per se.
Okay. It's still fairly early days in the drop testing, to be fair. So who knows what?
Yeah, maybe when the feature is closer to launch, maybe there will be some surprise. Who knows?
Yeah, indeed. Okay, thank you. Right, I'll change slide, which will please the people that aren't keen on the rendering. Looking at the chat, so apologies for that. Okay, so possibly these are the more interesting questions, I suspect. So does Google plan to allow users to turn ECH on and off? And if so, will it be on by default?
Yeah, so here, this is a question that I was also trying to understand what could be the motivation behind. And I think you forwarded me some additional context. But maybe let's first talk about this question as it is right now. As far as we are aware, we don't see any end user need that would require user control over ECH. And so we don't have a plan to make ECH available as some kind of like setting that people could turn on and off. But that being said, it could be the case that we miss something important. And so we want to hear like concerns, what user use case we are kind of like maybe getting in the way. And so if there are any additional details on that, I think you provided a few things. So I don't know if you have the context there, but maybe we can share some of what came up.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Do you have that in front of you by any chance, Kenji?
I do, yeah, I do. So I think, let's see.
Let me see. Oh, actually, it's okay. I've now located it. So let me do that. So on switching it on and off. Some scenarios where this might be applicable, and people can obviously comment in the chat, or if you want to join the conversation, raise your hand on this one, which might be useful. But for some context, users who want or are required to take advantage of filtering solutions and allow network monitoring may prefer to keep ECH off to allow these to function, and maybe when they're not in that situation, turn it on, conversely. In addition, I know that in previous discussions, it's indicated that ECH may impact on the delivery of QoS guarantees, as well as zero rating of access to particular services by network operators. And if that's the case, where users are on data caps, so mobile users with data caps, if they want to access that zero rated content, they may prefer to disable ECH so that it doesn't eat into their data cap and then switch it off, switch it back on afterwards. So those were a couple of scenarios where it may be appropriate. As I say, if others want to add to that, either in the chat or by sort of jumping into the conversations, feel free. But do you want to comment on those, maybe, Kenji?
Yeah, so one thing that is a bit unfortunate with ECH is that, unlike, let's say, a DNS-based solution, when you look at the DNS-based solution for filtering, for instance, there is a provider a centralized provider that you talk to get the answers. Whereas ECH is not designed this way. And so one of the downside with turning off ECH is that you would expose your information to a whole host of like different parties in ways where DNS doesn't, in a sense, especially if it's DNS over HTTPS, that's even better. And so it's a bit like problematic to have an option that is essentially like turning off like the thing that we really believe in terms of like improving privacy. It really like if you're driving a car and you say, I'm going to do without the airbags. Like, I don't know why people would want to do that. And so I think it would be better to try to understand, are there different ways to achieve what the user really want without risking like the user's like privacy or security, depending on the use case. And so here I think it would be better to take a step back and say, like, it doesn't seem possible to turn off ECH for a whole host of reasons that I mentioned, like by design, this idea that something is available to a whole host of like parties on the network in plain text is kind of by design not good for privacy, right? And so I think we should focus our like energy on finding other ways to address the use case rather than trying to find ways to bring this back to where the situation is at the moment, because it is not sustainable. It doesn't provide the privacy guarantees that users are looking for today. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the current way that I think about the space at the moment.
Could I come in on that one?
Yeah, please, Chris.
Yeah, so I'd like to mull over the zero rating case because in the UK, for example, EE is zero rating access to the NHS. And if we, obviously, clearly, if the NHS, whoever configures the DNS for the NHS, if they decide we're not going to support ECH, then it's fine. It means we can still zero rate access to them. But given who they are, they probably want to provide privacy to some of their users. And so it becomes a difficult problem, doesn't it? And so we've got some users who want to privately access the NHS, and we've got some users who want to have free access to the NHS, you know, perhaps because they don't have much money, they don't have a limit, they don't not able to pay for an unlimited data plan. So it's I get your point that yes, the ideal design here is not one that shares the SNI with everybody on the network path. You ideally need some mechanism where there's going to be an opt-in, and when that's opted in, then the information about it's going to be the information that the client is going to somewhere that should be free is only shared with the network provider and not with everybody. I don't think we're going to be able to solve that between a network operator and Chrome, but yeah, it's probably a wider ITF conversation.
Definitely, and you do understand that telling the user you have to choose between getting access to something for free at the cost of your privacy, or you can improve your privacy, but then you don't get access to this thing for free anymore. It doesn't sound like a good choice, right? It's not something that most users would say, like, I see why option 1 is definitely better than option 2. It's like, no, I don't want to choose between those two options. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, ideally we'd have both. Yeah.
There's a fun conversation to be had about sort of premium, there's not premium, freemium services there, but well, that's probably off topic for here. In terms of trading privacy and access, but anyway, I see that Killian has posted in the chat. I don't know if you can see that, Kenji. I'll read it out for anyone that can't see the chat. If you would need to have local DNS resolve local domains, the service delivery part would need to learn to provide an override list to the client if the entirety of the service shall remain secure. Then the question is where that service discovery wants to live. And if that list is supposed to be generic, then we want to discuss how to visualize to the user which domains came from which source.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we understand the context of this.
Killian, do you want to, if you're able to unmute, maybe just expand on that? If you're able to.
Sure, by all means. Hi, Kenji. Thanks for being back. So about the part of being back more often, I wouldn't mind personally, but that being said, yeah, the true question for all of this, secure DNS is supposed to be always full cloud only. I mean, for Google, it's a pretty natural thing to believe all services are supposed to be public cloud anyway, anyhow, anywhere. But that's not the reality for all of the enterprise networks and service provider networks. So the question really is, how do you make the cut from public internet to something that's more local, more GeoDNS, more service delivery of certain local services, and how do you inject those using DNS if all the DNS is centralized using secure mechanisms? Because that really is usually the cornerstone of, I need to break secure DNS if I want to inject something that's only supposed to be delivered and only be supposed to be answered and resolving for this piece of the network, because I have a special service that I want to introduce right here, right now. And then the second part is, if I want to have some kind of override, I mean, obviously I could also override YouTube, Facebook, Google, whatever, and say, these are my local services, and that's obviously bad. But where do we make the cut? Which is the local override permission, and how do we visualize that? Do we want to visualize that? Or are we just saying, yeah, all of the secure services supposed to be broken like we do nowadays with DOH?
Yeah, so one thing I want to make sure people understand is we don't have our approach to DNS over HTTPS is not to force a new provider, right? We've been doing the auto upgrade approach, where if we know that the current provider has a DNS over HTTPS version, then we'll use that with the same provider. And so if today this particular user is using a local DNS resolver, they are still going to be using that local DNS resolver. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I think Brian's restated the question, which, let's see if this is consistent with Killian's sort of meaning, which is how to do ECH on local network servers without split horizon DNS because of DOH. So it's the combination of ECH and DOH maybe here that's
okay. And
that's really how do we make those work together? How do we take your comments about security, which seem to be coming from DOH also, and break it to as little as we require to keep the services running for the local network part that we're looking at?
Yeah, so here my assumption would be that if you have a split horizon setup, I think it would be better if you handle DNS overall. And so I don't think it's possible today to have Chrome talk to two DNS service at once. It would talk to the local DNS service, and if it's local services, then you can resolve that as you would today. If not, then I think it would be better if you connect to a DNS over HTTPS service provider, but it doesn't have to be for everything external. And for those external services, if those services decide to use ECH, I'm assuming that all of that information would be just forwarded back to the local browser, and the connection would be made with ECH. But maybe I'm getting that wrong.
Should we maybe move on and come back to that? Give you a chance to sort of.
Yeah, if I did a poor job answering that question, maybe we should follow up offline because it could be hard to understand where we see exactly the scenario.
Okay. I'll also pick up the sort of question in the chat and go back to the list. I think it's pertinent here. So Pat has asked, will Chrome flag a TLS connection that hasn't used ECH versus one that has, in terms of the sort of the end user UI? So the equivalent of a padlock symbol. So will there be any visibility of whether something is using an ECH or not?
So there is no plan for this at this moment. whether or not we do something in the future, it remains to be seen what's the user value. Is there a need for it? But at the moment, there is no such a plan.
Yeah, fine. Okay, let's continue back with the sort of questions on the slide then. I thought that question M was the easier one, but we'll see. So, noting the importance of SNI data for threat detection, particularly in an enterprise network, what tools, if any, will be offered to networks such as enterprise networks that wish to disable ECH for their users? So, for example, is location, enterprise policy, or a canary domain considered here?
Yeah, so for those deployment, I think the way we think about it, and again, I could be wrong, so if there are like specific scenarios for which this doesn't really make sense, I would like to know about it. But the way we think about it is that IT admins today can already configure the DNS endpoint. And so we feel it's a better place to do this kind of like filtering to DNS, ideally DNS over HTTPS, if possible, independently of what ECH does. Because if we provide a feature that's like lets IT administrator disable ECH, then we are kind of back to the same situation than before, except for a smaller set of users. And I don't know if it's a good thing for like employees to have their like private information, or like even the company's private information just go out there in plain text across the whole network. And so it doesn't feel like a good idea to have a way to disable ECH where it seems that they are alternative to the main use case. So that's how we think about it at this moment.
Okay.
The other thing we've been doing is we do have enterprise and education customers, and so we are engaging with them through our partnership team. And so if we do find that our approach doesn't make sense, we'll have to go back to the drawing board and find a different solution.
Okay, so that may come out through the testing, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in a similar vein, and I'll maybe sort of pick up some of the explanatory comments on this as well. In some countries, schools and other educational institutions are required to operate effective content filtering, which typically relies on SNI data. And I know that's certainly the case in the UK and I think the US as well. So will such establishments be able to disable ECH? Yeah, so this is basically that there are contexts, schools being one example, where there's a compliance requirement, and ECH from an endpoint may be really quite problematic from a compliance point of view.
Yeah, I think this is similar to the previous question with maybe some difference. I think in the follow-up that I requested, there was some mention of bring your own devices, where maybe the IT admin doesn't have control over the device per se. But I think here, I think it's important to realize that a lot of things have evolved in the bring your own device space. Like for instance, like if you look at Android, and I'm sure that the same sort of solution exists for iOS and other platforms, there are ways to have a work profile. It could also be like a school profile, where you have your device, which is your own device, but then it's very clear that when you use this work or like school profile, you know that the IT administrator of the workplace of the school is aware of what you are doing, and they can set some rules. And so it's a much more transparent way of enabling those use cases than just letting like folks bring their own device and not knowing what's going on. Because for a lot of users, I don't think they would know that whatever they do on their device is something that the IT administrator can see, whether it's like through SNI and whatnot. And so I feel it's a better model for both like the school and the workplace and the employees or students to know that there are rules in place and certain behavior are expected. I think it's also part of the fact that you can't really solve this kind of use case with just technologies. I think you really have to, like in the case of students, educate like good behavior, like what is okay, what is not okay. And so like from my personal view, I think it's better to be more transparent about what is going on and making sure that users understand that this is exactly the setup that they are in.
Okay, So I guess to summarize from those three sets of questions, my takeout is basically at the moment there aren't plans to be able to switch ECH on and off. If through your current testing it becomes apparent for certain users that there is a need for that, you may reconsider, but currently it's fairly binary, it will be on.
And in the past, what we've done is when we got feedback that things are not like quite there yet, we're not just going to flip the feature on and like tell people to address the issue on their own, right? It's not how we work. And so if the different like institutions need time to move from where they are to this like better model of doing things, like we can certainly listen to that feedback and provide a way to get there without having anyone panic. I don't think that's interest to have like folks panic about what's going on.
No. Okay. I can see there's a few things in the chat, but I'll probably just finish off these last couple of questions on the screen first. So will you be using ECH on your DO lookups? If so, will ECH be attempted for every connection?
Maybe one more thing we'd like to add to the previous question is, and again, if I'm wrong, like folks should feel free to tell me that I'm missing something, but it was not clear to me, even if we were to provide an option to disable ECH, let's say, on a purely non-managed bring your own device scheme, you will still have to rely on trusting the students or the employee to disable that feature when they use your network, right? Because like the way this would work is that we're not going to listen for a signal from the network. We've been there with DNS over HTTPS. There has been a lot of debate about whether or not such an approach makes sense. And I think it's pretty clear that it doesn't really make sense, right? You can't really trust the network. You don't know what kind of network like you are dealing with. And so like if we were to provide a feature that lets that allows ECH to be disabled and it's on a bring your own device that is not managed, you're back to square one where you have to trust the users, right? And so it doesn't feel like a great solution to me.
Okay. I think there may be some comments in the chat, but let's finish off these last couple. So just back to that question then, Kenji, will you be using ECH on your DO lookups? And if so, will ECH be attempted for every connection?
So here, per implementation, Chrome is going to establish DO connection the same way it established over like other HTTPS connection. And so if we get ECH keys through that process, then Chrome will use them. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. So in terms of sort of signaling overhead for ECH, it's to put words in your mouth, but just test, that's pretty modest then. It's just to get that, and then it's done. Yeah. Okay. And then final one on the sort of the ECH related questions. What's your fallback strategy? It says when, could be kind of say if ECH fails. So for example, if a private network operator blocks it in some way, or it's blocked at a national firewall, or whatever the scenario is, if ECH fails, what is the fallback strategy?
Yeah, so here I think it's important to remember that your browser is your user agent, right? And so we essentially see ECH as like an important piece to improve privacy on the web. And so, like I said, we also believe that IT administrators have the tools and choice they need to secure their managed environment. And so given all of that, I think it makes sense for us to see when a website say, I want to opt into ECH, they are providing a signal that the mere fact of connecting to that service is probably something that the user doesn't want anyone else to know. I think we've got the example from the NHS, right? I think it's a good example. And so with that expectation in mind, if we see that the ECH connection fails, we are going to show an error page because it's important to let the user know that something that the website felt was important to get going didn't happen. The user could like choose to do something based on that, but I think it's important to inform them that something went wrong.
Yeah. So there'll be an NX domain like message to indicate a problem, and then the user needs to decide what to do next. Yeah, fine. Okay. So let's then look at the chat. to see if there's anything I can take out of there. So after Pat's question, Killian has suggested maybe APIs. Looks like additional development might be needed to look into the APIs from the enterprise NOC to use ECH that way. I'm not sure that's a question to easily answer.
The point is, like Kenji said, you're back to square one if you're not trusting the network, which may be a good thing for the privacy aspect of all. And still, the enterprise NOC, just being from the Chrome browser and the user agent perspective, being just any transport network into public cloud. Some of those may have a legitimate requirement to have that data. And the true question is, why is that a conflict in and by itself? And why can't we just embrace the security by design while just saying, all right, now the data just lives in the cloud. So all we need to do is pull it back from the cloud and have the cloud service offer an API so that we pull the data from where it already is, instead of breaking it to make sure it runs over our services and we are interfering with it. Which is the alternative. I mean, either we're breaking it, and that was the previous comment, how we're breaking it to the least extent possible to make sure most of the privacy benefits are still in place, which would be a good trade-off in the first place if that's being taken sensible. And that was the second question, how are we making sure that this sensible override list is only limited to those entities that we require and where they're supposed to go. And the other aspect is, if we're not breaking it in the first place, how can we jump forward and make sure the cloud service is giving us the data that we require?
Yeah, I think we need to go back to whether or not there is a relationship between the user and whoever has a use case for the data. In some case, I think there are better models today, like I mentioned, like when you have an Android device, and I'm sure that the same exists for iOS devices, there is a way to bring your own device in a way that makes it super clear that when you use this particular profile, everything you do there is visible to the IT administrator of the organization that you interact with. And so I think it's a much better model than the one we have today, where everything is available to anyone who dares to take a look at it. That doesn't feel like it was designed to be like this way. It's just like a side effect of how things were implemented. And obviously, there are like valid use case. Some use cases were like definitely not valid. And making sense out of that is very complex. I think it's better to have this model where there is a clear relationship between two parties.
Yeah, so going back 2 weeks, we're basically answering the service provider answer like, yeah, don't solve the problem in DNS, solve it in networking. Because if you're trying to solve it in DNS, you're breaking with either I have a local network and I manage the devices, and for all the unmanaged devices, everything is public cloud and the local network is only a transfer into public cloud. Because this is basically what I get from your answer. Like, either I control both the network and the devices and that I know everything, and I know it from the device, I have an agent or some mobile device management or whatever, or I don't manage the devices and I only manage the network, but then I'm degraded to a transport from your perspective.
Yeah, I think that's essentially the issue is, if you don't control the device, like today we are talking about Chrome and other browsers, but like there is nothing stopping a user from installing things that no one has heard about, right? They're like malwares that use Twitter as like a command and control center, for instance. Like there are like so many ways to avoid things that people take for like granted in terms of like detecting signals and whatnot. So I think it's a realization that things are not as simple as they are.
I'm more into the service engineering side and service delivery, the SD-WAN side of things, where I want to make good to better to best, instead of going the cloud security route and saying, yeah, I really want to avoid certain risks and mitigate risks and control, command and control traffic using DNS. Because the latter is just misplaced in DNS for a good reason. But still, I mean, the way to interact with Office 365 or stuff like that, there is a DNS component to that. And that's a totally legitimate DNS component to it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Office 365. But...
Or any other GeoDNS, which just may use DNS lookups saying, yeah, this service is 10% better than the other, so let's just drive it that direction. And some of the services want to use DNS for that. Some of them want to use the information from DNS to drive certain SD-WAN metrics, or some of them just try to redirect from the cloud. But then again, the cloud has no chance to get a full picture visibility. So that usually is the chicken egg problem, because the cloud doesn't know whether the client network transit is constrained in a certain direction. Because you're peering with a certain tier 1, tier 2 may just be overwhelmed, and you've private peering for a special IP address. And that's just solving the same service requirement, but it's not responded by default from how your lookups work, and you want to know about it and then do something else in some other process. And taking away the visibility is just wrong, and by design.
I think so. I think, Colin, you sort of nailed it when you said the scenario here is, if I interpret what Kenji's answers, if the device is controlled, whatever that means, by the enterprise, if we use the enterprise example, then we assume it's tightly locked down and everything's visible. And I think in your words, otherwise, the option is basically to transit the network purely as a transport facility with no access to anything other than the internet. So you're using it as a guest network, effectively, if you don't have that device control. It's the sort of model it sounds like here. Not just with Chrome.
This is exactly the question: where do I put the service discovery part from the client perspective, from the cloud perspective, and where is my message broker living in between reading information from the client, reading information from the cloud, reading information from the network, and driving that decision-making process and saying, okay, this is the optimal route, take that one because that's better. And that may include using a different FQDN, that may resolve the same FQDN to a different IP address, or that may include routing that IP address to a different target or to a different port. And all of those are things that do happen in transit networks in the enterprise. And the decision-making process may need to at least read those. I perfectly agree that in the easy example, none of this is relevant because we just have zero latency, unlimited bandwidth, and just the internet and IPv6 and everything, and everybody has perfect connectivity everywhere. But the reality is that this is not the case for all the situations the clients live in. And 5G local breakouts are one such example, sometimes edge compute. And that's discussions that folks are having, like, how can we stand up those? I mean, 5G is a huge hype for some aspects, and sometimes cloud breakouts with local edge compute do make sense. And the question is, where do you inject those in a sensible manner? And to inject those in a sensible manner requires knowledge about the traffic that you're forwarding. And
I can see Brian's put a comment in the chat, which I think has come up previously in similar discussions, which is really what you're describing really needs a new and different protocol to do that. That negotiation is probably the right word between devices and networks, because this is, I think this is a gap that has come up in other discussions as well, that yeah, it's a problem that is becoming more so ever clearer. I think as more stuff is locked down, then the need for some negotiation mechanism becomes even more apparent to overcome the lack of signal that previously has been used. I'm just because I'm just monitoring the time, so let me just quickly scan through to see if there are other easy questions. Oh, okay. A question from Brian Kenji. Are there thoughts, any thoughts about including or pinning ECH keys in Chrome so that they can't be blocked at the DNS level?
There's no plan for doing that at this moment. This is interesting. Maybe I will bring that back to the team. I didn't think about that. I don't know if it can work, but at the moment there is no plan for doing any of that.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
But again, if the motivation behind it is that somehow someone would want to find a way to like disable ECH, as it were, I think I would be more interested in the motivation behind that, because perhaps there is an interesting use case that we should be aware of,
yeah,
as opposed to folks trying to find ways to disable a feature, whatever it takes, right?
Yeah.
Because as I said, we really believe that this feature is important to improve privacy on the web. And so if someone finds a way to like nullify what it does, you can imagine that it's not going to be left as is, right? Like as long as we have this belief, we are going to find ways to make this feature work. And so if there is an important use case behind that, I really want to know about it.
Yeah. So I think that's the clear message from this part of the discussion, is to furnish you with sort of details of use cases where it would be appropriate to disable ECH. And then you perhaps revisit this, the ability
Yeah,
to...
and again, like ultimately, in a sense, ECH is just for those use cases, it's just a way to enable those use cases, right? And I think there could be other ways, hopefully better for privacy, but we need to have the discussion and explore what the use case is and find if there are ways to like address that use case without like running into like, well, we have to disable ECH. It doesn't make sense to go that way.
Okay. Right, so I think action on anyone that thinks that there are use cases that need to disable ECH, furnish Kenji with the details, but not right this minute, please, because we're about to time out. Right, let's go to the last question just for completeness. I can probably guess what the answer might be there to this, but I feel I should ask it as it was sent to me, which is, are there plans to support other recent IETF standards within Chrome, clearly?
Yeah, I mean, like from my point of view, like I'm only involved in DNS or HTTPS and ECH at this moment, so I don't have any like additional plan to share. As you can imagine, like when ECH first came along, someone in the team like took note of it, right? So if there are like interesting standards, you can imagine that there might be new efforts popping up. If folks have like specific question about a specific standard or like concern about it, I think it's always a good time to surface this concern and not wait until there is interest in it. Like the earlier the better, because we need time to go through the use case and the concerns and so on.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, well, as we're almost on the hour, let's wrap up there then. So as always, Kenji, really appreciate your time. And I think you made various suggestions where people can come back to you for various things. So I'm sure you'll hear back from a few people offline as well. But thanks for coming on and working through those. I'm just going to, for completeness, quickly cover off a couple of other points before I close the call. So just bear with me. So just briefly, a few interesting things in the sort of news over the last week, two that I'll highlight. One is there's a bit more information about Apple's private relay service from two of the CDN operators, Akamai and Cloudflare. So I know that would be of interest to some people who've been on these calls. And the other one I mentioned just now is ITF 113. The standard rate ends today, 23:59 UTC. So if you haven't registered and want to take advantage of the standard rate, you've got till midnight tonight UTC time. And similarly for submitting any internet drafts, it's the same deadline for those. And then in terms of future calls, most of these people should be aware of. So next week we'll go back to the usual time of 1600 UTC to talk about sessions coming up in ITF 113. Other ones I'll highlight. Andrei Meshkov is like to join us on 28th to talk about his experiences with DOQ. Rishaba will join us early April to talk about measurement of the performance of DOE, which I think will be of interest. And you'll see on the slide there's a couple of other things coming up. But as we're over time, I'll just briefly pause in case anyone has got anything that you really sort of desperately want to share under any other business. And if so, put your hand up or put it in the chat very quickly. I'm seeing no hands raised. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. And otherwise, thank you everyone for your time. Particularly thank you, Kenji, for spending another hour on this. That's much appreciated. And I've no doubt you'll get some follow-up responses offline as well. So have a fantastic week, everyone. And we'll sort of catch up 1600 UTC next week. So thanks all. Have a great week.